The Notre Dame football coach, Lou Holtz, was speaking at an annual sales meeting one year of the Western insurance companies, and he said this, quote, "I've been on top of the world, and I've been on the bottom. At Arkansas in my first year, we won the Orange Bowl, and everybody loved me. They put me into the Arkansas Hall of Fame, and they issued a commemorative stamp in my honor. But the next year, we lost to Texas, and they took away the stamp. People kept spitting at me on the side of the road. And one year, I tried to sell cemetery plots for a living. My wife said to me I couldn't sell anything, and she was wrong. That summer, I had to sell our car, our television, our stereo, everything." End quote. Like Lou Holtz, sometimes we find ourselves on top of the world. Anybody here ever felt like you're on top of the world? At any point in time? Yeah? How long does it typically last, that feeling?
8 years.
Oh, Enid, I don't know how you... It's a strong year. 8 minutes. Long enough to take a victory lap, winning a race. Long enough to receive an award. And then, like Lou Holtz, sometimes we find ourselves on the bottom, in the dark valleys of despair. Rock bottom. Have any of you ever been there? You might be there right now. Did you know that the first president of the United States to not want the Bible used at his inauguration was Franklin Pierce? It's been used every time since and before. The reason is rather interesting. Pierce was elected as president of the U.S. in the mid-1800s, and then he and Mrs. Pierce and their son were taking a trip by train 2 weeks before his inauguration. They were going to Concord, New Hampshire. And when their trip was over and they were leaving New Hampshire, Concord, the train had just pulled out of the station, Concord Station, and there was a lurch and a jolt, and the car that the president and family were in tumbled off the tracks and down an embankment. The president and his wife were fine. Their son was killed. Franklin Pierce brooded over this for the rest of his life. Many of us would do the same. He asked that question of God that so many of us have probably asked at different times in our lives. Why? Why me? Why, God? What is the point? I don't understand. Don't you love me? Why? And then, if you are honest about it, another question we ask that's related to that is, why are you doing this to me, God? Why would God permit this tragedy at a mountaintop experience in his life, just having been elected and just before being inaugurated as President of the United States? So upset that he refused to allow the Bible to be used. He so strongly believed for the rest of his life that God had failed him. Helen Hayes and her husband, Charles MacArthur, lost their 19-year-old daughter to polio. MacArthur himself died just a few years later, while Helen Hayes lived into her 90s and lived a most productive life. Her explanation for her husband's early death is that he never quit asking about his daughter's death that question. Why? Why did you do this? Why us? Why should it happen to us? We didn't do anything to anybody. We've never hurt anybody. Why, God? God. Why? Helen, living until a ripe older age, said that she saw many, many other people living in the midst of tragedies as well. And she asked, why not us? If we can ask, why me, in the midst of a tragedy, a crisis in our lives, why can we not also, should we not also ask when we have mountaintop experiences, why me? To experience those things. There was a widow in the city of Nain. She'd lost her son, whom she loved dearly, her only son, the scripture says. And like every mother, she probably had great dreams for her son. Life is sometimes very cruel. And we always hope that our children will outlive us. It is extremely painful, more than I ever want to know, for a parent to have to bury a child. The way life is supposed to work is that our children will bury us. But sometimes it doesn't happen that way. Her son now lay dead, and a large company of friends escorted the funeral procession out of the city. And their presence meant more than they would know to this widow. But the pain was still great. First her husband, and now her son died. Doesn't anybody know the emptiness that I'm feeling? She asks. Doesn't anybody care? Jesus just arrived in town that day from Capernaum, about 40 kilometers away. Capernaum is where he was, as we talked about it last week, where he had just healed a Roman centurion's servant, restored him to wholeness, life. And now here he is, outside the village gates of Nain. A large crowd and his disciples had followed Jesus from Capernaum to Nain. Question. I'll step out of the pulpit, that's this one. How many of you would follow me 40 kilometers to go from one place to the next? Probably not. That's okay, I understand. But they followed him. They were so captivated by his words, but also how much was it that they wanted to see him perform again? Another miracle. Prove to me that you really are God. Show us another miracle. Well, the funeral procession is going by. And back then, as in any small village or town today, everybody knew everybody else. You ever lived in one of those places? Where you can't come or go without somebody noting it and writing it down and asking you about it. They know everything that's going on. And most of the town was there to pay their lasting respects to this widow. The man who was dead, the young man, the widow's only son. And Luke adds a telling comment. When the Lord saw her, he had compassion for her, and he said to her, don't weep, don't cry. Have you ever been to a funeral for somebody that you were very close to, that you loved immensely? And people come to you, they line up at a funeral reception, beforehand and after the funeral service or memorial service. And they hug you, they hold your hand, they shake your hand, and they say things to you. Do you know some of the top things you don't say at a funeral? Oh, about a child. Well, God must have needed them more than you did. You don't say things like that. Well, they're in a better place. That may be true. I believe it's true, yes. But at that point in time, when they're so in grief, the better place that they want them to be is with them, at home again. But the one that takes the cake is what Jesus said. Could you imagine going up to somebody who's going to be in moments burying their loved one, and you say to them, "Oh, don't cry"? I mean, really? Only Jesus could get away with that. Don't cry. Spontaneously, and maybe without much thought, except from his heart. Jesus, knowing this woman, as only he could know as the Son of God. Knowing that she'd already lost her husband, and now she's lost her only son. He's moved with compassion for her. Significance of losing her only son? Now, as a widow, women 2,000 years ago in the Middle East were considered to be what? No better than children. And both were considered to be the same as slaves. Possessions. No rights. No hope. But she had a son. And a son meant she had a future. Her son would have been her retirement fund. Her RRSP to survive. That she would be home, and he would live at home, and he would look after her, and he would earn a living and be able to support her to old age and death. Not anymore. Jesus is moved with compassion for her. And later on the cross, Jesus repeats a similar action of compassion for his own mother. When from the cross, while he's hanging on the cross, Jesus says to John, the beloved disciple, about his mother, "Please take care of her," so that she would be looked after as well once he was dead. The funeral procession goes by, and Jesus is so moved that he touches what we would call today the casket. The procession, the bier that the body is carried on between people. He touches it. Now what's wrong with that? Come on, all you biblical scholars. A good, observant Jew of Hebrew faith never wants to touch anything that's connected with a dead body, because they will become instantly religiously defiled, contaminated, major cooties people, and he would not be allowed back in the community of faith for a period of time. He didn't care. It was worth it reaching out to touch him. And then Jesus says, "Young man, I say to you, rise." At which point, the dead young man sits up and starts to talk. And he's alive again. And Jesus returns him to his mother. Now, when you compare this story with other stories like this that happen in the Gospels, what's remarkable here in Luke 7, verses 11 to 17, is that there's not one mention at all of a person's faith. Whereas just the story before, Luke 7, 1 to 10, Jesus makes note of the centurion's immensely deep, simple faith in him. And he says, "I haven't met such faith in all of Israel." And as somebody who's apart from, outside of Israel, who exercised great faith in Jesus. Many other healings, there's mention of faith, but not this one. Not the faith of the mother, and certainly not the faith of a dead young man, is necessary for Jesus to perform this life-restoring miracle. Here in this story, the good deed is done. The miracle is done because of his compassionate heart. Moved him to do it. The widow's son is restored to life. And in response to this unsolicited act of compassion, a crowd of people are moved to awe and reverence of God. Not only the funeral crowd, but the crowd of people that had come with Jesus from Capernaum. Reverent awe as they glorify God, saying, "A great prophet has arisen among us. God has looked favorably on his people." And the words "a great prophet," do you know who that is? The words "a great prophet" would have been understood immediately by all the Hebrew peoples as being one man from the Old Testament. Elijah. The great prophet Elijah. Code word And this story in Luke is reminiscent of a healing story in 1 Kings chapter 17 in the Old Testament, where Elijah heals a widow's dead son in the town of Zarephath and restores him to life. There's even some exact phrases carried over from the Elijah story into this account from Luke. When Luke tells us that Jesus gave the young man back to his mother, that's the exact sentence that is used in the Elijah story. And that's good news for us as well today. Because we think in our despair, do we not? No one knows what I'm going through. No one can understand what I'm feeling, what I'm experiencing right now. But our faith reminds us the opposite is true. Yes, indeed, someone does know. In one of his books, writer and philosopher Loren Eiseley tells about the time when he was only a young lad and his father died. His father died at home before the widespread use of painkillers. He died a painful death, and his wife was deaf. So young Eiseley was the only one alone who heard the agony of his father in his last days and in his death. And he says a curious thing happened to him during that very stress-filled time after his father died. He was so tense that he could no longer even bear the ticking sound of his clock in his room. So he smothered it in a blanket, and it was still so loud that it sounded like, he said, it sounded like it was ticking right inside of his head. He tried to sleep, and he couldn't. His distress, his loneliness, his sadness was so great. And that was when help came. His grandmother saw the light burning on in his room in the wee hours of the night, and she came in and sat with him and held him. And he knew that someone understood and that someone cared. And then when she was old and died, he held his grandmother and he touched her hair, and he realized a new way that in those moments when he was a young boy, she had practically saved his life. Eiseley never forgot what that meant to him. To know that someone sees and understands. Sometimes that's all we need in order to help us make it through whatever particular time of crisis we're going through. Sometimes, though, even our closest friends are blind to our despair. Sometimes there are persons in our own families and very close neighbors who just don't understand and don't see it. Sometimes we never pick up on someone else's agony and great despair. It's as if we're all blind at times. But Jesus is never blind. Do you know what that is? Christ the Redeemer statue, Rio de Janeiro, Brazil. Do you know one of the things about this statue? It demonstrates he has no sight, stone eyes. And yet, it's a profound statue that is meaningful to millions of people around the world. Jesus is never blind to what we're experiencing. He sees us in our distress. He hears us every single time we call upon him. And he gets it. He understands. And here's part of the glory of the cross of Christ. Jesus understands all of our loneliness and all of our despair, all of our pain. Why? How can that be? Because he's been there too. Because he became Emmanuel, God with us. He became one of us and experienced every temptation that we would ever possibly experience. He experienced every form of suffering we would ever. And he understands. A couple of years ago, the New York Daily News carried a story about an anchor woman named Pat Harker who left her luxurious East Side condo with 80 cents in her pocket and spent 5 days living on the streets in order to learn what it's like to be homeless. Harper spent the days wandering the streets of New York City in the icy January rain, and her nights sleeping in doorways and in train stations and public shelters. And she began to realize, by the end of her week, that most of the homeless people were not very much different from her. Several people helped, gave her food and advice on how to survive without any money. The undercover investigation made her realize that many homeless people are simply normal people who have been hit with financial problems from which they haven't been able to rebound and don't know how. There is no other way to know, she said, no other way for her to truly know how they feel than for her to have tried to live as one of them, to walk where the homeless walk. Well, there's another one who left the comfort and convenience that he had in heaven to walk where we walk, to journey where the outcasts journey. He's the same man who took compassion on the widow of Nain, and he still walks with us today. That is the message of the cross. He walks where we walk. He's always by our side. And when it's time for us to walk what's called the Via Dolorosa, the way of suffering, he is walking it with us. That is the hope that the people of God hold on to when our dreams have been dashed, when our burdens seem more than unbearable. Because he sees and understands, Jesus gives us the strength of his Spirit to carry on for him. Even if Jesus had not raised the widow's son in Nain, just seeing Jesus and being with Jesus would have been enough. For there's something about the Master's love and compassion that helps and has helped countless millions of people endure in the midst of great suffering and sorrow. "27 years ago, I became a hospital chaplain in Toronto, at the Queen Elizabeth Hospital. It's not called that anymore. There's a chronic care facility, long-term. One of the patients who lived there for over 70 years, all of her life, had been put in it when it was first called the Toronto Home for the Incurables, when she was a 3-year-old girl with polio. It was a profound place to work. I loved it. I was assigned all the floors of the one location. There are 5 floors. But only the south side of the building. My boss, the head of chaplaincy, looked after the other 5 floors on the north side of the building. And she said, the first person I want you to visit, her name is Karen Booth. And good luck. And I said, okay. So I went up, found Karen's room, 5 South, room 10. I walked in the door, knocked on the door, walked in, and she was in a wheelchair, had suffered horribly from an operation, then went back about 5 years earlier. Lost her husband, who divorced her because of it. Lost her children because her husband kept the kids. She was permanently in a hospital and rarely saw her kids. To say that she was a bitter woman would be an understatement. And here I march in, wearing my suit and tie. Hi, I'm Mark the chaplain. I was not greeted very well. Thankfully, on the one side of the coin, when Karen spoke, she could only speak one letter at a time or one syllable at a time. And you had to be sitting this close to her in order to hear what she was saying. So I immediately forgot everything I was going to say and sat down beside her and asked her to help me learn how to hear her and listen to her. And she could move her arms very slowly, and her hands were crippled up. And she moved her arm over to the arm of the wheelchair, and she pointed. On her arm of her wheelchair were 3 little blocks, the alphabet. And she would say 1, 2, or 3, and I would say, okay, so block 1, you're trying to say A, B, C, and we would communicate like that every time. So that first time I was with her, it took an hour and a half to understand what she was trying to say, that it would take you maybe 2 or 3 minutes to say. And what she said to me was, what right do you have to come in here and say anything about God to me? What do you know about pain and suffering? And I went, wow, those are really good questions. And I said, can I get up please and shut your door? And she said, yes. So I got up and I shut her door because I didn't want people to hear me, what I was about to tell them. I sat back down and I said, thank you for asking me. And since you're being brutally honest with me, I'm going to be brutally honest with you. And I will tell you the little bit I know about pain and suffering. And I told her in about 10, 15 minutes a few things. And both of us cried. And after that, we became fast friends. Such friends that she listened to me and I listened to her, and I advocated with her, for her, on her behalf, with lawyers and with the hospital's staff and board. And when Emmy and I moved to Calgary in 1990, a year and a bit after I finished at the hospital, she came out to visit us in Calgary. Brought a nurse with her, and her first trip was to see us. Profound woman of faith who didn't know how to move beyond why me, and wasn't prepared to take anything from some young whippersnapper Christian who thought he knew everything. At that time I did know everything. Now I don't. And what did I tell her? After I shared with her a few things that I had experienced of suffering and pain and extreme sorrow, I said I discovered there's only one way that helps me, and that is to develop a personal relationship with God. The God who loves me and you perfectly, passionately, profoundly, and forever. And we came to understand, sharing together over the year and a bit that I was chaplain there, that there's a difference between saying, I have problems, I have troubles, versus saying, I have problems, but they don't have me. Because I know the one who walks with me. I know the one who sees and who understands and who is able to not only be with me at every point, but to meet every one of my needs. So sometimes, as Karen and I talked about, sometimes we're on top of the world. Sometimes we're in the valley, the darkest valley of the shadow of death. And as the youth group talked about this past Friday night, where do you think we tend to learn the most from and grow the most in our faith? On top of the world or in the dark valleys? In the dark valleys. That's where we realize the depth of God's passion for us. That he never, ever leaves us. Wherever we are in this life, God is with us. Period. Thanks be to God.